Welcome back to my Age of Wonders 4 tier list. If you missed part 1 for my unit enchantments, I'd recommend you check that out. We talked about how I'm thinking about power, timing, opportunity costs, synergies, the uniqueness of effects as I evaluate the different ways to enchant your units in Age of Wonders 4. Let's jump straight back in with where we left off, which is at the start of a very interesting collection inside of the Materium tree. Starting in a very interesting place, we of course have tomes. In this case, it's the Tome of Enchantment. Literally in the name, everybody. What a great place to start. Firstly, we have spell-tempered shields. Now, of course, the Materium focuses more with its internal synergies on defense. This one is about unit enchantments and physical damage, but in this case, of course, defense comes right the way through with our shields getting +1 resistance to all shield units, and their defensive mode is buffed, arguably even more considerably. Their defensive mode provides +1 resistance to the unit itself and all adjacent allies. You'll probably have adjacent allies. Given the way that Age of Wonders combat works, how the AI or you may be controlling your defensive formations, this is a really significant buff, only to one type of unit, of course, the shield unit, but they will themselves likely have +2 resistance on a given turn, where, of course, they're defending, and they'll provide a bit of extra resistance to their allies. Strong in the early game, of course, slightly weaker as you move through. I think that Spell-Tempered Shields is a very good effect. It's basically the only way that we can pick up resistance out of these enchantments, at least within the Materium line. And of course, it synergizes really well with the overarching theme of defense, in this case resistance. It is only applied to shield units, but the benefit that's applied by essentially allowing them to give +1 resistance to everyone else, I think puts this firmly at an A tier. Of course, it's cheap cost. The fact that we can get it right from the beginning of the game also factor in to a really significant buff for early game conflict and a strong synergetic effect. Sticking inside the Tome of Enchantment, we have Seeker Arrows. These grant physical ranged attacks of enchanted units +1 range. Probably not that difficult to get online for both your ranged unit and your skirmishers. Your skirmishers will benefit from the next one that we're looking at as well within this tier 1 tome. Of course, there are plenty other ways to enchant units. I don't consider that caveat to be particularly significant. So what this is doing essentially is providing us with +1 range. Potentially, we can strike the enemy down before they can hit us. Maybe we're less susceptible to some of the obstacles inside of a battlefield. +1 range is a nice effect. It's not all that overwhelming though. An enemy with more damage won't be bothered too much by +1 range, and generally speaking, you'll be able to close the distance pretty easily here. There are some internal synergies with having a shield wall up the front and having your ranged units back a little bit further so the enemy can't hit you, but you can hit them. All of this is a little bit circumstantial, but I don't want to take away from the fact that having one range over your opponent will obviously be a benefit. There is potentially some slight anti-synergy, i.e. with the one we just looked at giving resistance to adjacent units. Maybe the range isn't particularly necessary there because you're already going to be right up defending against a front line, but I think there is some tactical advantage to this one. It's quite circumstantial, depends heavily on the makeup of your army, the makeup of theirs, where you're fighting. I'll give it a B tier ranking. And the final one inside the Tome of Enchantment is Sundering Blades. Sundering Blades does two things. Firstly, it gives us that demolisher effect we looked at last time, enabling us to smash through any fortified obstacles. The main thing that it does, and it provides it across the 5 melee classes, is it grants melee attacks of enchanted units. Again, not too much of a caveat required there. A 90% chance of inflicting sundered defense. This reduces enemy defense by 1 and their status resistance by 1. It's important to note that it also stacks 5 times. This is in many ways the spiritual opposite to the plus 10% damage that we see out of Strengthened. In this case though, of course, sundered defense, stacking with up to a -5 defense and -5 status resistance on the enemy. This is a wonderful, aggressive option inside of what up until this point has been at least somewhat defensive, and of course, generally a fairly defensive class. At a 90% chance, it's almost guaranteed. 9 out of 10 hits will guarantee you -1 defense and a reduced status resistance. I think this is a powerful effect. Combined with Demolisher, you'll be able to smash through fortified obstacles really lower their defense, and it's a wide-reaching buff. Sundering Blades also happen to be the only way really to lower enemy defense inside of these enchantments. And above all else, I think they provide a really fantastic benefit, unlocked very early on at tier 1, relatively cheap to cast, and universally applied across our melee attackers. For me, this is an S tier pick. At tier 2, inside the Tome of Artificing, we have Artisan Armaments. There's a lot of R's in that sentence. It sounds like I'm at the dentist. This one grants enchanted units, again, basically all of our units should be around this point, plus 30% critical hit chance. It applies across 6 different unit categories, not, unfortunately, of course, applying to specifically our magic units, but applying to everyone else. A 30% crit hit chance means we have a 3 out of 10 possibility of inflicting an extra 50% damage, taking a 25 damage strike up to 37.5, for example. At a 3 in 10 chance, it's not an overwhelming possibility, of course. In fact, it's more likely to fail than succeed. But it is being applied across all of our units, essentially, at least 6 different categories, and all of their attacks. You shouldn't struggle to get this off every turn without fail multiple times. 30% is still generous enough that you can see a significant number of your swings receive an extra 50% damage. Very good. And again, applied across heaps of categories. Unlocked at tier 2 and with a relatively cheap cost to cast it, coming in actually pretty comparably to something like Sundering Blades from a tier below, but of course providing a 30% critical hit chance across all of our physical or ranged fighting units. I think that this one is an S tier. It's perhaps a slightly weaker S tier than a couple of others, but really not by much. It's an S tier enchantment for me. Inside the tier 2 Tome of Winds, where there is, by the way, a brilliant archer unit to unlock. This tome, fantastic. This enchantment, well, let's take a look. A skill level 3 spell. This one gives one unit type, our scouts, flying mounts, allowing them to fly. This will, of course, enable them to traverse the map much easier. They'll be able to fly over obstacles that would have otherwise potentially pinned them into an area, including people and geographical features. Unlocked at tier 2, it is potentially not quite as impactful as most other things. It only hits our scouts, and I don't think that's especially useful. Don't get me wrong, them being able to fly is nice, but the overall power here I consider to be very low. There are almost no synergies, at least within this class. Of course, you can buff your scouts with the generic benefits, and if you're going down that scout build, you'll likely also have picked up a few traits from the shadow affinity. I would argue that that shadow affinity will actually be a much better one for you as a whole than Materium will ever be for a scout-based build. And I don't think that this pickup really provides a great deal of power overall. Synergies not there. Uniqueness it certainly has, although compared to other scout upgrades, it's potentially just one of many. Windborne Scouts for me is a D tier pick, a category reserved obviously for the worst of the worst. Don't get me wrong, a caveat here to fans of this one. There are absolutely synergies for it. They do exist. There are a few enchantments, a few traits, and a couple of different builds that do lean into scouts. But I think across the board, as by the time you're reaching into tier 2 unlocks in sort of the later early game, you're unlikely to be getting a great deal of benefits out of giving your 1 or 2 scouts wings, and I think for that reason, it's a D tier pick. Also inside of tier 2, we have the Tome of Artificing. This one has a nice little enchantment called Siege Magic. Siege Magic grants plus 10% damage. It also provides Siege Breaker, dealing extra fortification damage during a siege, so you'll be able to bust down their siege faster, adding extra fortification damage like this to progress your advancement of the siege, breaking down their defenses, the city health. You'll also receive Demolisher, so fortified obstacles during the combat, during the siege, like their walls or what have you, won't be an issue. Now, this enchantment applies to support units and to battle mage units. Of course, it's about magic, it's about siege magic, but it's important to note that that plus 10% damage is applied universally. Yes, Siegebreaker and of course things like Demolisher are specifically focused around sieging and taking down cities, but the plus 10% damage is applied universally. For me, Siege Magic sits in and around the top of the tree. I'm considering, or have considered, a high A or a low S tier. The plus 10% damage across the board is really great, and it's applied to our magic units, not just the battle mages, the support units too. Then we have Siegebreaker, which will make all future sieges a little bit easier, dealing extra fortification damage as a result of these mage and support units. And finally, they'll be able to smash down enemy defenses. I think it's a very well-rounded upgrade. It's very well-rounded with synergies both within the class, within the tome, and universally applied damage. It's relatively cheap to cast, at least comparable with Tome of the Winds, and I think that its benefits are very wide-reaching. For me, it was initially a strong A tier. I'm actually going to place it at an S tier though. I think this is a really top tier pick, not just within the class, but also within the broader categories and the time that you'll be unlocking this upgrade. I think its unique effects also set it apart from many others in its field. It's fantastic at sieging, but it's also a generally useful benefit across all combat, regardless of what you're fighting and whether you're attacking or defending. Moving through to the slightly more expensive, we have the Tome of Transmutation at tier 3. It provides us with adaptive armor. Once per turn, whenever enchanted units, we're assuming basically all of our units, sustain non-physical damage, okay? So it can't be a physical attack. Maybe they're being shot by a lightning bolt. They will gain bolstered resistance, +1 resistance, stacking, by the way, up to 5 times, and also status protection, providing them with 2 status resistance, again stacking up to 5 times. This one reduces the chance that they'll be afflicted or affected by a negative status effect. They're unlikely to go mad or crazy or what have you. Bolstered resistance, of course, providing resistance to those non-physical attacks. So all of this only takes place when our unit sustains non-physical damage, okay? Important to keep that caveat in mind. It's cast across a wide variety of our melee attack units, which is great to see, and it provides with a stacking benefit, and stacking benefits are generally really good because you'll be able to get this stacked a lot. It's whenever enchanted units sustain non-physical damage. This is very easy to pull off. Enchanted units, once per turn, so that's across the board across these units, and all they have to do is take non-physical damage. Hero abilities alone and extra equipment and that kind of stuff can do this. I wouldn't worry about the caveat too much. The benefit is very great. A huge amount of resistance and a huge amount of status protection across all of our units. Being tier 3, it is of course a bit more expensive. However, thankfully, we're not yet required to specialize, right? It's not at a tier 4 or tier 5 tome. So I can apply slightly less of a penalty to the cost, although of course we'll assume that you're going to be able to make the most of it, i.e. my assumption that all of your units will be enchanted, basically all of them, still holds. I think that adaptive armor is absolutely brilliant. Materium is the king of unit enchantments, and this one again doesn't disappoint me. For me, it's a solid S tier, one of the few ways to gain and actually a very high amount of resistance and status resistance. For me, it's an S tier pickup and a great way to potentially counter some weaknesses here too. Inside of a tier 4 tome, Tome of the Crucible, and at a fairly expensive cost, we have Meteor Arrows, the upgraded version of the kind of arrows that we've seen inside of other classes. In this case, it applies to our physical ranged attacks, ranged units, and skirmishes, and it provides our attacks with +5 fire damage to the target and to adjacent units. Generally, you'll be able to pull off adjacency quite easily. The armies, the enemy armies, and your own will probably move in groups and formations, so that one is fairly safe that you'll at least pull that off a few times. Maybe you're dealing +15 or even 20 fire damage across the enemy army, and you'll also gain, again, another way for us to get Demolisher on our attacks. This time, of course, applied to our ranged attacks instead of our magical ones, and that is all that this provides. +5 fire damage to the target and adjacent units, and a Demolisher ability that we have already seen before. The Demolisher ability is nice, but unlocked only on a couple of classes and this late in the piece, remembering that we've had to move through to tier 4 tomes to get here, so it's relatively late in the game and does require some specialization. I don't think there's enough internal synergies alone to push for that specialization. The fire damage from the arrows is absolutely nice, and the fact that it has that splash damage effect is great. And like I say, you should be able to pull that off, ensuring that you'll at least probably be dealing about 15 fire damage on average per strike instead of 5. But because it's so late in the piece and the relative lack of internal synergies, the fact that it only applies to 2 classes, and the benefits aren't actually that profound, I don't rank this one very highly at all. For me, it's a C tier and a relatively low C tier upgrade. I don't think it's the kind of thing that you'll be beelining towards. I think there are many other better options, better enchantments, and better things to research across the board at this level. And for that reason, I'm placing it at a low C tier. And lastly, inside of Tome of the Creator, we have Eternal Earth. At a tier 5 tome, of course, I don't need to tell you that the level of specialization that we've gone into at this point is very high. We could even be just securing the start of our magic victory, getting our final tile improvement built so that we can tick down the 15-turn timer. In this case, it's a whomper of a unit enchantment. It grants enchanted units, probably all of our units, Undying, which restores them to life upon death. The unit will revive with 50% of its total hit points after 2 turns, and it can only be triggered once during battle, so you can't keep infinitely doing it. All of our enchanted units, which at this point should basically be everybody, will be restored to life. That's really strong. The downside is that they come back with half of their health. This is not unusual for some revive abilities. Others don't have it. Others might choose to use something like lifesteal or cannibalism to keep themselves alive instead of needing to be revived. The 2 abilities work somewhat similarly. In this case, it's potentially slightly worse because of that 2-turn timer that it takes. There's a very real possibility that you'll get to use this on a lot of units, but not all, because it takes 2 turns, the final 2 turns of the battle. Those units who perish won't see any extra benefit. Coming back with 50% health, like I say, isn't necessarily unusual. It's a slight drawback, of course, potentially impacting on different things like morale as well as unit formations. Overall, though, this is a very, very powerful ability. Unfortunately, ring-fenced very late in the piece. Probably the last enchantment you should be getting. If it's not, then you probably haven't won the game fast enough and you're lingering for too long. I think it's undeniable that giving your units Undying is really great. In many ways, this one deserves not really even to sit on this tier list because I'm making pretty harsh weighting trade-offs, right? It takes a huge penalty for being weighted towards the end, meaning you won't get to use it much. But that is basically and almost entirely taken out by the fact that this is a very unique and very powerful effect. Though you do have to specialize quite heavily to get there, and that's especially important with tier 5, because we can't get access to anything else within tier 5. So that makes this trade-off more significant than most. I think, all things considered though, this one is really a top tier pick, likely falling between S and A tiers. For me, I'll be ranking it at an A tier with just a slight dink for that need to specialize, that anti-synergy with other tier 5 unlocks. For me, it's a strong A tier. Let's move on to the cheapest chips, beginning the Tome of Evocation. Inside of this wonderful Astral Affinity, we have Lightning Focus. Lightning Focus provides our base magic attacks. I'm going to assume slightly that we'll have, on average, more magical units inside of this build than others. We'll receive +2 lightning damage. Very nice. No trade-off there, just a blatant +2. And we'll get a 30%, a 3 in 10 chance of inflicting Electrified on the enemy, dealing 8 lightning damage. This is, of course, very similar to what we've seen before in terms of dealing fire damage, in terms of dealing blight damage. In this case, the unit will be electrified, not burnt, dealing lightning damage to them. It applies across our magical units. Again, I'm assuming we'll have slightly more than in other categories, and we get the lightning damage. This one for me is a really strong contender at A tier. I think it ranks on par with many of the other things that we've compared it to within the A tier or potentially the high B tier groupings. Extra damage, a chance to inflict the opponent with -8 a turn, which is very good in the early game, And of course, we have this basically from the start. So we'll apply this extra damage the entire game across a specialized group of units for us, our magic wielders. It's an A tier. Inside of the Tier 1 Tome of Warding, we have the Staves of Warding. Go figure. This one makes our support abilities, so just our support units, and it gives us a +2 bolstered resistance to all of them. This one is nice. It stacks up to 5 times. We've talked about the benefit of stacking. How quickly can we stack it? That's the question we have to ask. It makes support abilities of enchanted units +2 bolstered resistance to the affected unit. So there are a few layers at play here. It's only applying to our support units, and what it does is it changes them. It changes the very nature of them, changing their support abilities to grant an extra 2 resistance. So for example, my Sun Priest here has Mending Awakening. It's an ability that I can use, targeting a friendly unit, healing 30 hit points, and providing them with Awakened. Now, when I cast that with the Staves of Warding at play, it'll also provide that unit with bolstered resistance, providing 1 resistance and stacking up to 5 times. In this case, it grants them +2 bolstered resistance. This is powerful because our support units will, of course, be using a lot of their abilities. That's literally what they do by design. And in this case, it's going to make all of their units, all of their abilities, I should say, slightly better with that bolstered resistance that stacks. So if we happen to target the same thing twice in a row, which we may or may not do, we'll receive extra resistance additionally. I think that Staves of Warding is very strong in offering a slightly unique ability for us to bolster our resistance, somewhat rare, not just here, but more broadly. And unfortunately, it is only applied to our support units and only when they use their abilities, so there are a few caveats there. I place the Staff of Warding inside of what will be a fairly full category by the looks, sitting just above average at the A tier ranking. Reminder, of course, B tier being straight down the middle, C tier needing some work, D tier avoid at all costs, A tier above average, and S tier really solid, really, really good picks. Inside the double whammy that is the Tome of Amplification at tier 2, first and foremost, we have Amplified Arrows. Amplified Arrows applying to our 2 ranged classes, our physical ranged units. It gives them 4 lightning damage, and in exchange, they lose 2 of their physical damage. This is, of course, potentially a slight trade-off, maybe not beneficial depending on who you're fighting, but great for synergy within. It also provides us with a 30% bonus of their damage to another target within 3 hexes. So you can think about this as kind of like a chain lightning effect. You deal damage to a unit, and 30% of their damage will be dealt to another target within 3 hexes. This is really strong. Even though it's only 30% of the damage, it's kind of like you get to attack 2 units in 1 turn because, go figure, you do. Granted, it only applies to ranged units because it's arrows, but with the extra power and that chain lightning ability, I think this is a really great pickup. For me, Amplified Arrows sits at a high A tier, really close to placing this one at an S tier, sat on the fence. It's one of those every sort of 5 or 6, maybe every 7, there's one that I'm quite stuck on. This was one of those. I'm going to place it at an A tier. For its overall power, the 30% extra damage to another unit is very strong. It is, of course, only applied to our ranged units, potentially not the focus overall of this category, but we do have some other nice guided projectiles and a few other synergies in future, which makes me confident that this is an above average ability and a strong A tier contender. Inside of Amplification, we also have Frenzied Focus. Frenzying Focus provides, you guessed it, Frenzy. And it provides it to our Battle Mage units and our support units, potentially the stars of the show. Frenzy is this great ability because it stacks. Basically, it provides Strengthened, which we've seen before, plus 10% damage, and it stacks 5 times. Super good. It provides it when? Well, let's have a look. So it's our enchanted units, so we need to be enchanted first, obviously. I'm assuming you'll be able to pull that off. And it happens when damage is dealt when they attack. So we have to attack to pull this off. We can't be attacked by the enemy. And every time we attack, we'll get strengthened, stacking 5 times. You should be able to stack this at least a few times. You'll be dealing an incredible amount of extra damage out of your battle mages thanks to frenzying focus over a few turns. Your support units, of course, are also incentivized in the class, not just to keep your units alive, but to provide them with extra resistance. I think there's fantastic internal synergy with frenzying focus. It's a fairly easy thing to stack. Again, I don't think that stacking this 2 or 3 times is out of the question. In fact, I think that's probably a given. Getting it up even higher shouldn't be all that difficult. This is a very strong buff to damage, and likely much more of a buff to damage than the opponent will ever be able to resist, particularly at that plus 40, plus 50% range. It's almost like every hit is a critical hit, and that's not even considering the fact that you can still get critical hits. When I see frenzying focus, I want frenzying focus. I think it's overwhelming power, even though it only applies to a few of our key units, really sets it apart from the rest. It's cheap to unlock, it's easy to grab, it'll carry you through the rest of the game. For me, it's an S tier pick. Inside of a tier 2 tome, we have guided projectiles, applying to our magic, but also our physical ranged units, right? Our ranged and skirmishers. This enchantment, makes base attacks of enchanted units ignore accuracy penalties from obscuring condition caused by units that are in the way and by certain terrain. Units that are obscured find it more difficult to hit the enemy, 40% harder, in fact, to hit the enemy with ranged attacks. There'll be plenty of obstructions throughout the map, including, as it mentions here in the tooltip, units that are getting in the way, happens all the time, and certain terrain features or obstacles that will get in the way. This enables your enchanted units with ranged attacks to ignore those penalties. So any penalties from anything in the way, and reminder, it's a 40% penalty, will be removed. This will make your ranged attacks, generally speaking, quite a bit stronger. It may also make your ranged units easier to defend, so they can stack their strengthened, their frenzied bonuses, for example, while other units take the hits up the front. I think there's a lot of tactical importance to guided projectiles, though there isn't necessarily an upfront benefit or gain in yield. Of course, that benefit comes from not being suffered, or not suffering from the 40% harder to hit range obstruction. I place guided projectiles at a C tier. I think it's a solid pickup. It doesn't always apply. Of course, there may not be anything obscuring your view. You may also position your armies in such a way that those things that are in the way don't matter. When it does matter, though, it's great. For me, it's a B tier pick. At tier 3, thankfully no specialization yet at a tier 3 tome, and a great one with teleportation, by the way, we have Phasing Enchantment. Phasing Enchantment gives our battle mages and our support units, the star of this class, of course, the phase ability, allowing them to teleport in battle. As you can see, it's an always hit ability. It can only be used once, and it allows the caster to move to a target hex. You can't move, of course, across the map. You're a little bit limited in how far you can go, but even the likes of 3 tiles should be far enough to get you out of a pinch, behind an enemy, protect yourself. Movement abilities are quite rare. Getting out of an enemy flanked position is great. Getting out of a position where you might be surrounded or perhaps you need to move behind cover is great. It does align a little bit with guided projectiles that enabled us to sort of remove the obscuring condition caused by units that were blocked by certain terrain. In this case, we're able to phase past it. Although, of course, this only applies to our battle mages and support units, not our physical ranged units. I'm not entirely sure that this phase ability is all that useful except to save your backside. Yeah, you could move to get a flank on an enemy. Maybe you could move to deliver one more punch that you couldn't quite manage to do because you didn't maneuver your troops properly to begin with. But I don't think that at tier 3, this is anywhere near as powerful as a lot of the other things that we're unlocking. It's quite a situational ability, and it does only apply to the couple of stars within our class. If Phasing Enchantment could be used multiple times, I would certainly rank it higher. I think it's very useful in a pinch when you need to get an enemy out, or maybe when you need to reach through to just get one more strike off that you couldn't quite reach within your range. Potentially you were being obscured by an obstacle. The ability only being able to use once, though, does make it a little weaker. In an ideal world, I have an army of 6 total, potentially in the fight, battle mages, a couple of support units, and they're able to teleport to an enemy that's weak, pick it off from its enemies, or potentially run away and protect themselves. As an overall benefit, though, compared to other tier 3 enhancements, I don't think that this one provides a whole lot of value at all. And for me, I'm going to place it at a D tier pick. Don't get me wrong, it can be useful to have a phase ability on your units, and I imagine I'll cop some flack for this one. But for me, it's quite similar to its comparison. It's friend here in the D tier, though unlocked later at a higher cost for a higher price with greater upkeep. And I'm not sure that the ability justifies it, given its situational use. For me, it's a D tier pick. At tier 4, with a bit more, of course, specialization required at this point, though if you're going for this build, that's unlikely to be a problem, we have Mirror Veil. Mirror Veil is a very interesting one in the Tome of Astral Mirror. It gives our shield units and polearm units. This is one of the first things we've seen specifically targeted for these units inside of this class, by the way. Important to note. You don't have to be doing an Astral exclusive build to get this, but you do need to meet the requirements for the affinity in order to unlock a tier 4 tome. It allows our enchanted shield and polearm units, all of them, of course, because they'll all be enchanted by this, goes without saying, but I do need to reiterate that after some confusion last time, reflect 50% of non-physical damage, for example, magical damage, back at the attacker. What a fascinating one. That is so interesting. It's like a mega shield, everybody. Your shield units and your polearm units reflect half of the non-physical damage, that lightning bolt that hit them, straight back at their attackers. Very, very good defensive ability. It's unfortunate that it's unlocked inside of this class. We don't see a lot of other benefit for our shield units or for our polearm units within the astral affinity. So there's a need to not only focus down this tree to pick this up, but also to focus down another tree to get the other powerful enchantments that might be hidden within tier 4 or tier 5. So it's important to note it's a little bit difficult to pull off, and it doesn't actually impact a lot of the units that we may be using. We should have a few of these in our army though, and we may have picked up other upgrades for them throughout the rest of the tree. And so for that reason, I think that while it doesn't apply across the board, it does apply okay enough. Mirror Veil for me is a B tier pick, partly because it lost a huge number of points in how I weighted the overall opportunity cost for it. Again, not a bad ability, very strong at what it does, but the time that you need to invest in order to unlock it, the trade-offs that you're making to get it, and the overall cost, given the fact that it applies to a type of unit that we haven't focused on, that we have no other synergies for me, ranks it at a B tier. And inside of the Tome of the Archmage, again applying those same caveats that I applied to the last tier 5 upgrade that we looked at in terms of specialization, the late unlock and cost, we have Cosmic Overdrive. Cosmic Overdrive gives all of our magical origin and combat summon units, and we are a magical people. This will be the overwhelming majority of what we're delivering. 30% extra damage and very fast movement. For extra movement, not just in combat, but also on the world map. Should we be using teleporters for our movement or spells? Yeah, we should. Granted, we have many other ways to move around. But in a pinch, that faster movement across the map is nice. Faster movement in combat is also great, because it gives us yet another way within this class that we can move around the battlefield, right? We have the phase abilities that we can potentially unlock. We can ignore obstructions on the battlefield. Anything that is potentially obscuring our view of our ranged attacks can be removed. And now we can just flat out reposition and move faster. But really, of course, it's the 30% damage here that's a great buff. It's like stacking 3 of those strengthens on top of each other. Important to note that it is just like stacking 3 of those strengthens on top of each other. We've had ways much earlier on and without anywhere near as much cost or specialization to get 30% extra damage, though this damage is universally applied almost without caveat and without any sort of build-up time. We don't need to strike the enemy 3 times or have 3 spells cast before we get this 30%. We just get it. Cosmic Overdrive for me is, for all of those reasons, an A tier pick. Of course, the anti-synergy, not being able to pick up other tier 5 stuff, and the immense cost do take away somewhat from this, what is otherwise an incredibly powerful ability. I think also it does lean in quite well with the broader affinity, the building of mana and research. It's a really great pick. For me, it's an A tier. And finally, we move to the Shadow Tomes. Here we have the Tome of Cryomancy, and inside of the Tome of Cryomancy, we have a familiar formula. It's Frost Arrows. Frost Arrows, of course, provide you with a net +2 to your frost damage by adding 4 and removing 2 physical damage. They also provide 20% damage against frozen or slowed units. Important to note, the unit must be frozen or slowed in order to pull off this benefit, making it actually a little bit worse than a lot of the other comparative effects. And it really does seem fair at the highest level to compare frost arrows with flame arrows and so on and so forth. And these ones are slightly worse, requiring frozen or slowed enemies to deal what is, granted, a nice 20% extra damage. It's important to note that Frost Blades do exactly the same thing in terms of their damage output, adding frost, removing physical, and again, there's a focus on frozen and slowed units, something that we may be able to deal with a little bit better, of course, as we move through and start to unlock more things. So pulling off that caveat isn't necessarily the most difficult thing, but it does exist, and it is a slight debuff against comparable upgrades. For me, Frost Blades is slightly more useful than arrows, like we've seen in previous groupings, because it applies to a wider variety of units, right? The Frost Arrows essentially only specifically apply to ranged units because skirmishes are counted in both blades and arrow upgrades. It's for that reason for me that Frost Blades deserves an A tier ranking, some synergies with slowed or frozen units, and a reasonable upgrade, of course, leaning down the frost damage pathway right from the word go. And for me, the arrows are slightly worse, actually, because they're really only applying to ranged units, while Frost Blades has everything else covered, though it's a benefit that I can't knock. It's unlocked early, it's super cheap, it's a great way to deal extra damage and some synergies, and for that reason, I'll be placing it at a B tier. Of course, there's a strong internal synergy around souls, and so inside of Shadow, I'll be assuming that you're leaning into that a bit. Here we have Soulbinders, a unit enchantment unlocked right from the word go, basically at tier 1. It gives us a 90% chance of inflicting soulbound on a target, increasing the amount of souls we'll gain when they're destroyed. In this case, it's increased by 2. And we'll also receive plus 10% damage against units with soulbound. Because our attacks from our enchanted units, in this case applying to mages and support units, have a 90% chance of inflicting it, we won't see this play out a lot at first, the plus 10% damage, but as you move through a fight, you'll be nearly guaranteed to start casting an extra 10% damage. There are other ways to force an enemy to be soulbound as well, plenty of other opportunities, upgrades, and spells to do it. So I'm going to assume, by and large, except for the first 1 or 2 turns, it should be fairly easy for you to pull off the extra 10% damage. And of course, you'll be farming extra souls. The internal synergy here for a tier 1 unlock is really high, very strong. A unique way for you to harvest souls, and a 10% damage multiplier that should be applied generally to a lot of your battle mage and support unit attacks. I think Soulbinders is a strong A tier pick, sitting roughly in the middle of the class. I'm ranking it favorably for everything I've just discussed, and also the fact that it's a great way for us to get souls online early. Souls could be a very key part of a Shadow affinity build, lots of internal synergies, and the plus 10% damage to the unit classes is great. At tier 2, the Tome of Necromancy, we have Necrotic Magic. Sounds a little dirty almost. It grants attacks, again for our battle mage and support units, a base 60% chance, 6 in 10 chance, of inflicting decaying, damaging them over time and preventing them from regaining their health. We've seen this a little bit before, right? +5 blight damage each turn, and they can't regain their normal hit points. Of course, ethereal and undead units are immune to it, so some things can counter it, but by and large, this is a nice buff. 5 blight damage each turn, and they can't regain their normal hit points, though they can still regain temporary hit points, and there are heaps of ways to gain temporary hit points, so it's important to keep that in mind. The anti-heal capacity of Necrotic Magic is a great counter to some of the early game healing that you might strike from nature or order, and the blight damage is nice. Important to note, though, that it's only a 60% chance, so there's a little over half a chance that our battle mages and support units will inflict decaying on the enemy. Decaying is a great ability, stopping hit points but not temp hit points, and adding a little bit of blight damage, but at 60% and only applying to 2 units, it's difficult to say that this will be able to be universally applied, especially early on when we're unlocking it. Later in the piece, there may be ways to resist or remove the decaying ability, and ways to regenerate temp hit points or other healing or defensive abilities. I believe Necrotic Magic is a C tier, slightly below average pickup, just because it doesn't quite get to really use that ability enough. Blight damage and anti-heal, don't get me wrong, is great, but around this point in the game, I'm not quite sure it delivers actually enough extra power. +5 blight damage is really all that it does. Yes, it does continue through turns, which is wonderful, but it just a little over half a chance to pull it off, and needing a few turns likely to start striking them down anyway. I'm not sure it's as impactful in the early game as you might think, and therefore doesn't quite compare to some of its competitors, and for that reason, it's a below average C tier. At tier 3, we have Tome of the Doom Herald, and inside of it, Cruel Weaponry. Cruel Weaponry is quite fascinating. 30% extra damage against units with a morale of low or worse. Neutral morale, -19 to 19. Low, they need to be below -20. And then beyond that, of course, they can be very low, and then routing, they're running away. That one we don't really want. High morale as well, of course, can increase their critical hit chance. So being able to mess with the enemy morale and get 30% extra damage if they're placed down here at low or worse is great. They could fumble their attacks, reduce their damage, and overall that's a nice benefit. As we can see, it's applied across the board to our physical stabbers from shock units, also through to skirmishers, and 30% damage is a wonderful buff. Really good, like right up there with some of the best damage buffs we can see. The downside is that enemy units must have low morale. And up until this point, we haven't necessarily leaned into morale with our unit enchantments, but it's important to know that chaos, that shadow, is all about morale. And if you combine it with a little bit of chaos or a little bit of something else that you might be adding into shadow, then this actually isn't as difficult as you might think. It is quite a big caveat though. If you're coming up against an enemy that's also focused on morale, this will be entirely useless. It can be combated, it can be negated, but it's a pretty wide-reaching benefit for a tier 2 unlock, and it has very strong internal synergies within. Cruel Weaponry for me was a really difficult one to place in the end because of that need to focus on morale. Morale is, I find, a little bit more difficult to measure, not because we don't know how it works, as you saw we do, but it's harder a little bit for me to predict. It's easier for me to assume that you'll have X number of mages in your army, or that you'll have a lot of beasts in a nature beastie build. It's a little more difficult for me to assume the kind of morale impacts you'll be able to carry out, but I think that the overall synergy and the plus 30% damage make this a strong A tier contender. Inside of tier 3's Great Transformation, where we do have the cheapest major race transformation currently in the game, we also receive Fetid Legion. Fetid Legion is a unit enchantment that, as you can see, gives us plus 10 hit points. Nice. It also gives us Weakening Aura, which weakens nearby enemy units' attacks, so adjacent enemies will become weakened. The unit next to a unit inflicted with Weakening Aura becomes weakened every turn. This stacks up to 5 turns in a row and provides a minus 10%. If we thought about spiritual competitors for strengthened, this is the actual competitor for strengthened, right? You literally just refracted it or whatever and got the opposite. In this case, the enemies lose 10% of their damage, stacks up to 5 turns, and all they have to do is stand next to us. And all they have to do is stand next to our shield, pole, shock, fighter, or skirmish units, who all have an extra 10 hit points. If you can't already tell, I think this one is fantastic. I think the extra hit points is universally good. Weakening Aura's only caveat is that we have to be standing nearby to an enemy. Weakening nearby enemies' attacks. We should be able to do that. We should be able to stack it very easily. I think this is a great pick at, granted, a somewhat high cost, though not too unusual for everything else within this very powerful tome. Fetid Legion, for me, sits right up at the top, an S tier ranking. And last but not least, the final thing to review inside of the Tier 5 Tome of the Eternal Lord, we have True Death Magic, applied to our support and battle mage units. This one grants base magic attacks of all of our enchanted units a 30% chance of inflicting Marked for Death, which kills the affected unit at the end of the effect's duration. The unit cannot recover hit points and will die when Marked for Death expires. A very powerful and very interesting effect. This one is obviously really expensive and carries the same Tier 5 caveats that we had earlier on. The specialization, the deep cost, the research. In this case, casting it uses souls instead of mana, arguably also making it just slightly more expensive, but relatively minor. Applying to 2 different unit types, this Marked for Death curse is fantastic. Units can't recover hit points, and then they perish. Really great. 30% chance, so we have a 3 in 10 of inflicting it. There is a little bit of a slowness to this effect that we don't see in a lot of the other Tier 5 abilities. We don't get the 50% strength that we might get from stacking Strengthened and Demonic Focus, plus the extra hit points to keep us alive. We don't get a lot of the other sticking power abilities, like all of our units come back to life after 2 turns when they perish inside of Materium, for example. What we get instead is the ability to mark the enemies for death, ensuring that they won't recover health over the next few, and then they'll perish after the fact. It is only a 30% chance. And it's for that reason, and the high specialization that's required by True Death Magic, that I think that actually it's outclassed by a lot of things that we can unlock much earlier on within this grouping. And it's also outclassed by many, if not all, of its Tier 5 unit enchantment counterparts. Now, it's not to say that it's a bad pickup, but I think as far as the Tier 5 enchantments go, it is potentially the worst one of all. Now, they're all very powerful, and I am ranking them, for the most part, with a significant weighting put on that opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of getting it and of what I'm choosing to take instead of it if I'm choosing to not research it. It's for that reason I actually don't rank this one very highly at all. I'm placing it down at a D tier. I concede, though, that that could seem a little unusual for such a powerful effect to be ranked so low. You have to remember that power is one of my 4 considerations, and while it ranks off the charts almost for power, it doesn't really pick up any other points across opportunity cost and overall unlocks. Even across the internal synergies, it doesn't really present many, except for providing a use for souls, and its effect is somewhat unique, though timed very late in the piece. Again, the end game is when this should be surfacing, and I don't think it's quite powerful enough to compete with some of the other end game race enchantments, and also some of those major race transformation that I've covered in a separate tier list video. So let me know, what do you think of my groupings for these enchantments in Age of Wonders 4? I think generally speaking, the enchantment unlocks are ranked slightly above average in power compared to a lot of the other things that we'll be unlocking in Age of Wonders 4. And I think that's reflected in my final rankings here, with A being the highest ranked group, and then S and B coming in with relatively few items placed at the C or D tier levels. Let me know which ones are in the total wrong place and how I'm an absolute moron for not placing your favorite one in a different position. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you all next time.